Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar titled Top SOC 2 Compliance Questions Answered. I'm Mike Hoffner, Managing Partner at McKonly and Asbury, and I am pleased to be hosting and moderating our discussion today. For those who are not familiar with our firm, McKonly and Asbury is an accounting and business advisory services firm with offices located in Camp Hill, Lancaster, and Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. We're a leading SOC audit and IT consulting firm and have a deeply experienced team that has been performing SOC audits since they used to be called SAS 70 engagements. This specialty continues to be one of the fastest growing areas of our firm. We also provide a wide range of other services to organizations across a variety of industries, as you can see on your screen. We do encourage you to visit our website to learn more. If you've joined us in past webinars, welcome back. If you haven't, our monthly webinars feature various business topics to keep you updated on what's going on around us and in the community and in the marketplace. With rapid changes in legislation as a result of COVID, we've added to our monthly lineup to bring you additional content on the ever-changing regulations, including Paycheck Protection Program, Employee Retention Tax Credit, and other matters. So be sure to check out our website and catch past presentations, as well as keep an eye on current information coming out. Before we get into the meat of the webinar, we need to talk about a few housekeeping items. First, if you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the built-in question function on your webinar control panel, and we will do our best to answer them during our live Q&A towards the end of the webinar, or if we don't have time to get to them, we will try and respond afterwards on an individual basis. We also plan to address any questions submitted during registration at the end of today's presentation. For those who are looking to obtain CPE credit for the webinar today, please keep in mind there will be 3 polling questions throughout the presentation, and you do need to answer all 3 questions to get your certificate via email. So please keep an eye out for those, and as you see them pop up, answer them, and we'll make sure you get your CPE. So that's the housekeeping matters. Before we dive in, let's take just a minute to introduce you to the team that will be presenting today. As I already mentioned, I serve as the firm's managing partner, but I also spend a significant amount of my time focused in our SOC practice as well as in other assurance practice areas. And I also serve as a peer reviewer and a SOC specialist, so it's an area that is important and near and dear to my heart. Joining me today is one of my business partners, Dave Hammarberg. Dave has been an integral part of overseeing the firm's internal cybersecurity and IT infrastructure needs, and also serves externally as a key leader in our SOC services practice. Dave also provides cybersecurity consulting, leads the firm's cybersecurity maturity model certification practice, and does a lot of other things on the side, as you can see from the number of initials after his name. Our other panelist today is Josh Bantz. Josh is a principal in the firm, serving in our assurance services group, and has been working alongside me in providing SOC services for, I don't know, Josh, for a long time. We'll just leave it at that. Josh has expertise in both SOC 1 and SOC 2, and also serves in our firm's affordable housing segment. So I'm glad to have both Dave and Josh joining me, and I am actually really looking forward to getting out of the way and letting the two of them share their wisdom and their experience over the next hour. Last thing before we get into the presentation is just as already mentioned, our SOC practice continues to be one of our firm's fastest growing segments, and just wanted to acknowledge that we perform all aspects of SOC services. As you can see, we do pre-assessment, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3, and SOC for cybersecurity. So if there's any need that you find yourselves in, whether it's as an organization needing a SOC engagement or a reader of one of your vendor SOC engagements, we'd love to have the opportunity to chat with you about that need. So with that, let's get into the content that you all came here to hear. You didn't come in to hear me speak about 7 slides of introducing Josh, Dave, and the firm. So what are we going to go over today? We're going to spend just a few minutes reviewing SOC 2. What are they and what are the uses of the various types? That foundational framework is really important before we get into the most frequently asked questions that we encounter. So we've listed a few of those frequently asked questions on the screen that we'll be going to. I want to remind you, though, that part of this is not just to answer the questions that we hear on a regular basis, but to answer the questions that those of you who have joined us today might be asking. So please use that question feature and send us the questions you have, and we'll make sure we address them to the extent possible over the course of our presentation. So let's get into that first polling question, and then we'll start answering the important part of what we're here for. So first polling question is, which of the following is a trust services criteria that can be included in a SOC 2 report. So really our purpose in asking this question, A, is so you can get CPE, let's be honest. We have to put them in, so answer to the best of your ability. But also it gives us some sense of your exposure and experience with SOC engagements, SOC 2 in particular, and what's included therein. So if you can just take another couple of seconds here, and hopefully everybody can log their answer. And then, hey, Dave and Josh, if there's anything you want to say to kick things off, now's your chance.
Did a great job, Mike.
Your words of affirmation are meaningful, Dave.
Looking forward to the webinar.
Good. Well, we'll why don't we give just another second or two here while people finish up answering, and then we'll close it out and see what the results of our polling question was. All right. So let's see. All of the above. So the majority of our audience, Josh, are they correct?
They are correct, Mike.
They are correct. Excellent. Well, I know you're leading us into the next section of the discussion. So, yep. So there's confidentiality and privacy are both correct answers, but as they always try and trick you on the SATs and PSATs and all the other things that we all never want to go back and do, all of the above is a critical answer to consider. So with that, Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about just reviewing the types and uses of SOC 2, so we set the framework and groundwork for where we're going to go next.
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon and give everybody a little review of a SOC 2, the types and uses before we dive into these questions, just to provide a little background and a little refresher for everybody before we start getting into the technical kind of meat and potatoes of our frequently asked questions. So the SOC 2 is a report on controls of the service organization, and it's specifically relevant to the trust services criteria, which are issued by the ASEPA. Those criteria are security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. So, in effect, the report on those on your internal controls of the service organization is specifically related to controls that are required to be met, and control objectives required to be met related to those trust services criteria. There's a lot more we can talk about with this, but just as a brief refresher, I thought I would kind of throw that in there. Note, not all of those criteria are part of every SOC report. Security is the baseline, must be met. The others can be added on. So, at a minimum, any SOC report you receive, SOC 2 report you receive will have security as one of the criteria. So, and it's intended, the report's really intended to meet a broad range of users that need detailed information and assurances about the controls at a specific service organization that they use, specifically to maybe how they process data or what data they maintain. Really, when we speak to that, the SOC 2 really speaks to, what the service organization's controls do as it relates to security or availability or processing integrity or confidentiality. So, it's one thing to think about when we get into some of these other questions, is you really want to think about not just the intended use, but who is a service organization that you may want to get a SOC 2 from. So that's something to remember is, it's generally going to be an organization that does one of controls related to one of those attributes, say security or availability. What types of service organizations are candidates for a SOC 2 report? I think one of the series of companies and organizations we deal with, think of IT-related organizations. We see data centers, software as a service, but really, quite honestly, it can be any organization that maybe maintains, holds, processes data for another organization. So, those types of organizations really are where we want to focus. Think about, service organizations that you as a company may provide your information to, or they may process information for you, or they may perform backups of your IT environment and so forth. Obviously, those are all organizations that would be candidates. So, it's kind of a very broad scope, but one way to put that out there is to really think of organizations who specifically, take data and or process information that your company may be the owner of that information. So, There's two types of SOC 2 reports. The type 1 report is related to the design effectiveness of internal controls to meet the specific trust service criteria as of a specific date and time. So the type 1 report really just states that, hey, these controls are designed effectively to achieve and meet the trust services criteria as of X date. It does not speak to the operating effectiveness of the controls. So typically a type 1 report kind of is, hey, these controls, if operating effectively, are designed to meet the trust services criteria. The type 2 report is much more in-depth and requires substantially more testing on the part of the auditor. And that is a type 2 report is the report on the design and operating effectiveness of controls. So not only are those said controls at the service organization designed effectively to meet the criteria, but they're also operating over a period of time. So for example, January 1 to December 31st, the controls would be designed effectively and operating effectively.
Just to add to that, Josh, I think, from an IT standpoint, for the individuals on the webinar that aren't getting a SOC 2 or need a SOC 2, but are requesting a SOC 2 from vendors, I think it's real important that you know which one you're getting. As an IT individual, I really want to see a SOC 2 type 2. And if I don't have a type 2, I want to know why they don't have a type 2. There might be a legitimate reason, like, hey, we just started the SOC 2 this year. We're doing type 1 to get one started, and we're, the next year is going to be our period, and we're getting a type 2. That's a great answer. That's, hey, you're on the ball. We're, we're going to move along with you. But if they have a SOC type 1 because that's, they want to do the minimal effort, et cetera, and I have two vendors, and one has a type 1, one has the type 2, I'm probably going to lean to the type 2. So, I think years ago, a lot of people got these reports and they didn't read them, they didn't understand them. People are getting a lot more intelligent when they're reading these. So I think, for this audience, you're looking for a type 2.
I could not agree more, Dave, especially with, in the evolution of this and having worked in this area for the last 15 years, it's really the evolution of what's being requested in the vendor management and so forth, where, organizations are stepping up and determining, what vendors they're using and what the risk is related to those vendors to ensure that, hey, these vendors are holding data that is technically our data. We need a SOC 2 and preferably a type 2. And there's not easy ways around that. And I think most people on the webinar today, most of the participants today will realize that, can probably attest to the fact that there's a lot of, proposals and a lot of things they see out there and a lot of contracts that pretty much demand a SOC 2 type 2, no ifs, ands, or buts, or they're not going to contract with you. So
on the same note, if you're an individual that your users are requesting a SOC 2, sometimes you get intelligent users asking for a SOC 2 and sometimes you don't. So, you really have to, I think, to be fair, to understand the SOC 2, type 2, and sort of give your users what they want without giving them too much. And I think we'll get more into that in regards to the scope, et cetera. So
with that, we'll kind of kick this back over to Mike as we start to go through the frequently asked questions and provide our input on those questions.
Yeah, it was a good overview, guys. And we have done and could do an hour-long presentation on the types and uses of SOC reports. So if all that went over your head as a listener on our webinar today and you want to understand really what those guys were just talking about, please reach out because there is a long conversation to be had on types and uses of SOC 2 and when you should be looking for certain things, but not the purpose of today's discussion. So Dave, you teed it up great. You used a word that is really critical to setting out on the journey of doing your first SOC report and understanding how to read a SOC report. And that word was scope. And we talk about scope on our side of things like it's obvious because we live, eat, sleep, and breathe this particular type of service. So often when we start talking to a client and we ask the question, okay, you need a SOC report, or we're evaluating a SOC report, what's the scope? What are we covering? We realize that we really need to expand and explain what does scope mean, and not only what does scope mean, but what should you be thinking about in terms of scope. So Josh and Dave, first question for our discussion today is share some thoughts on two things. First, what what does scope mean? What is scope in context of this question? And second, how would an organization decide and define what needs to be in scope for a SOC report they're trying to do for their customers?
So, Mike, I can kind of kick that off here. In the question of what is scope and what is an organization's scope is a very broad question and probably one of the most difficult questions to answer. I think one of the things that's difficult about it is every organization is different. So to define the scope of your SOC 2, really, you really have to define what your organization does and provides for your customers. What services do you perform? Certainly, an organization that provides data center space for their clients. Obviously, the scope of their SOC reports probably going to look very much at the data center aspect of what they do, which is how do they provide security, how do they provide space, how do they ensure things stay up and running for the customers who have servers located there. Whereas a software as a service company may have a very different scope, specifically if they're doing something limited to software development. And in that case, the scope of their SOC report or SOC 2 is going to be focused primarily on the processes and controls that they have around that software development process. The one thing that I will say about a SOC 2 is, the SOC 2 in the trust services criteria, specifically security, which is the baseline criteria that has to be met, incorporates a lot of control environment controls as well as risk assessment, information communication, kind of that COSO set of control objectives into it. So to some extent, all organizations, regardless of the scope of their SOC 2 report or the services they provide, do have things that they have to meet related to, HR, policies, procedures, hiring, risk assessment, things like that. But when you start developing your controls and you speak it, to what controls are going to be incorporated in your SOC 2, you really have to drive at what services and what do you do for your customers. And then that becomes the scope of your SOC 2. One of the easy ways to help define scope, and Dave can kind of chime in here as well, is what customers of yours are asking for your SOC 2 report. That's kind of a good way, and what do you do for those customers? That's one way to really initially start this process of finding your scope of services is, really being able to understand who's asking, who wants it. Hey, it's all these clients that we provide X service for. Well, at that point, those clients obviously and customers obviously feel like the services you're providing to them are key in their processes and what they are providing, what you're doing for them, they need more sufficient assurance over those services that you're providing. So, Dave, your thoughts?
Yeah, Josh, you really nailed it. Several different areas there, but it's funny. I think every organization we go into, and I think it's from a security background, you think you want to secure the whole organization. That framework covers the whole organization. This covers the whole organization, and a SOC 2 really covers what the user entity wants. What's the essential activities or services that you provide to the mass majority of the clients that are requesting the SOC 2. That's what it comes down to as what the scope is. If the 5 essential services over 30 clients is, covers in the SOC 2, and then one miscellaneous client has this and this, that's not going to be covered under the SOC 2. Maybe there'll be questions outside of that, but it comes down to, what is the majority asking for? And I think there could be organizations that have multiple SOC 2s, different organizational units, et cetera. And you hit it on the nail when you said control activities and control environment. A lot of those controls are going to be exactly the same, but then the controls around logical, security, et cetera, are going to be different with those organizational units. But it's tough. It's very tough for an IT person, an IT security person, to understand scope in the SOC area because it's so limited. And then to dive in and put controls around that scope. But if you can nail that in the beginning, the controls, defining the controls, et cetera, goes so much smoother. But it's a tough spot to be.
Couldn't agree more.
I think we often see a desire, as Dave said, to to expand way more broadly than is necessary. And Josh used the example of a data center for a SOC 2 earlier. A data center, a security professional wants to make sure that, say, their QuickBooks and their Office 365 is secured. And so we automatically step up and think organizationally, those are that's part of my job. I want to make sure they're covered. But reality is the user of your data center services does not care if you have good controls over your QuickBooks environment. So you really need to narrow it down, as both of those gentlemen said, to what exactly are we trying to cover for the user's purpose.
You got to go back to the beginning of why are we doing these SOC reports anyway, right? You know, we used to have these 150 security questions from each vendor. Well, now we have a SOC 2 report that covers those questions and they can hand them out. So, you know, are we answering the vast majority of those questions, et cetera?
It's good. I'm going to move to our next question, unless either you have something to add on that one.
No.
All right. So our next question, which really ties right into the idea of scope. So once we've defined the systems that are in scope, is really to then take the step back and say, which of the 5 trust services criteria that Josh had mentioned earlier need to be included. So Josh and Dave, 2 questions here again. First, what does an organization need to think through to decide what trust services criteria need to be included the first time they ever do a SOC report? And then second, and we often don't think about this, I think, in general context, is once I've done a year or 2 or 3 years worth of SOC reports, that second question is, what would be the indicators that would say I should revisit the trust services criteria I've been including in previous reports, and should I add or remove something from that report?
So, you know, the trust services criteria that should be included in the SOC, SOC 2 examination, there's a few things you really want to consider here. Is, as I said earlier, security is in your SOC 2 report, whether you want it in there or not. It says very clearly, I made a comment that security is the baseline, and security incorporates also what we call the common criteria, which is the criteria that must be included in the SOC report includes control environment, information communication, monitoring, things like that, before you get to the very specific controls related to the scope of your organization. So, the next question is, as you move beyond the fact that you're going to have security included is what is the scope of services? We talked about scope earlier, and it kind of goes hand in hand, as Mike said, scope of services provided by your customers, and to your customers by your service organization. And, I think you look at availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy, and it really comes down to, what are you doing for your customers? I mean, one very clear, example is the data center. Obviously, if somebody's, has servers, they're paying you to host servers for them, you're certainly going to be expected to have availability and be able to provide connectivity at your data center, and be able to provide electricity, and be able to provide those types of things to ensure that their systems stay up and running, and based upon the commitments you've made, that there's probably not going to be downtime. You have generator backups, et cetera, at that data center, whereas you may have a very different, depending on the organization, you're processing other aspects of your processing data through your software for customers. Certainly in that situation, you may be doing processing integrity to ensure that that the inputs, outputs, and processing of that data before you turn it back over to your clients is accurate. So I think one of the things we really want to speak of is what are your contractual commitments? What are you doing? What is it you do? Look at the review of your contracts with your customers, where the services are outlined that you're performing, and align those to the trust services criteria. I mean, certainly one thing I will say about picking some trust services criteria, and then I'll let Dave kind of chime in on this as well, is more is not necessarily better in this case. I mean, I think people think that because there's 5 trust services criteria, we want to overachieve and hit it out of the ballpark and do all 5. Well, in many cases, privacy is not applicable. If you're not, if you as a service organization is not taking customers, personally identifiable information or data that the customer may have to that effect, there's no real reason to have privacy if you're not out collecting private data on behalf of your customers and so forth. There's really not reasons to incorporate that or include that. So those are things to think about as you go through this, because certainly overachieving is not necessarily something you really want to boil it down to the services you're providing and what trust services criteria are applicable to those who are going to use your report and those which would be your customers. So, Dave.
Yeah, I think again you nailed it. So good job. I think it's very rare that you see a client that gets a SOC 2 report without a user entity asking for it. So I think that's where it begins. And depending on the education again of the user, what are they asking for? Do they know what they're asking for, or is it just, hey, they went to a security seminar and it said, hey, you need SOC 2 reports for all of your vendors. So when you get the SOC 2 request, and especially in the beginning for a new client that is doing a SOC report, you really have to understand how educated your user entity asking for it is. And you have to understand for yourself that it's going to take, depending on the client, a lot of time, pre-assessment, a lot of time to get these controls in place to get a SOC 2. So with that being said, you have to understand the request. If you have a SOC 2 type 2 and that's what they want, well, then I would give them security. If they're not outlining the different principles, I would give them security, because that's going to be enough trouble work for you to get that done. Now in year 2, 3, maybe we look at adding a principle, or maybe the user entity asks for that. Josh made some good points there, but I think in the beginning, I think you focus on what needs to be done and then go from there. Now, SOC 2 usually is, for, hey, we do these controls, et cetera, user entities, but I have seen clients that, sort of use it as a marketing thing. Hey, we have a SOC 2, type 2, et cetera. But I think, like I said in the beginning, no one gets a SOC 2, type 2 for the fun of it. It's just not, the most enjoyable thing. It's not like you're going to the beach, right? So
Dave doesn't lead our sales function here at the firm.
I do not. So that's my answer.
Okay. So are there cases, either of you, where you would see removing trust services criteria from a report that's been previously done? I know, Dave, you mentioned you might want to add in the future, but what are those triggers where you need to reevaluate?
Well, I think if it doesn't mean, if you do the, say, privacy and it's not applicable, like Josh said, and it means nothing to the user entity, there's no controls in place, et cetera, it's a waste, and I think it almost weakens the report. You have great controls in security, maybe availability, and you get to privacy and you're like, I don't know, it's just, you're ending on privacy and you're weakening the report. I mean, that's an opinion, but that's my opinion.
You're spot on, Dave. I mean, you don't want to, if we don't have instances to test because you have privacy controls, but they're not actually being, they're not actually quote unquote operating, it does weaken your report, so to speak, because certainly you've incorporated all these things that you quote unquote aren't doing because you don't have any private client data that's being held. So certainly that's a valid point.
I mean, a majority of your clients are going to get this SOC 2 type 2, the people that are asking, and they're going to look for, exclusions, something that doesn't fit, something that, a control that didn't work, and when you get to something that's not applicable, there's going to be more notes and et cetera. It's just going to complicate things. So I like simple, I like complete, I like, no exceptions. And I think that makes the strongest presentation.
Fair enough. Good. Well, let's move on to the next in our questions that we encounter most often. And that is about the length of the reporting period. So as Josh had already mentioned, a type 2 report that tests the operating effectiveness of controls covers a period of time. So Dave, I'm going to kick this one to you so Josh doesn't give all the good answers and then you have to give him praise for it. We'll let you go first, give all the good answers, then he can tell you how good you did. So Dave, how do you determine the length of the reporting period for the time a customer needs to come figure out how to do their SOC engagement?
In reality, it's mostly dictated by the user entity. You know, they're coming to us because they need a SOC 2 report, and the user entity wants it by a certain amount of time. Obviously, I think majority of our SOC reports type 2 are either 6 months or a year. A lot of times they'll end at, you know, a time period, whether that's December, June, or whatever that correlates with the user entity requiring that information. Obviously, all reports get stale. You get a SOC report that's 4 or 5 months old. You know, do you really have confidence that the controls are still performing like they did when they were tested? Is there changes in the environment that have happened that those controls are no longer applicable? So there's a lot of things that go into the period, but I think in reality, it all comes down to, hey, how quickly can we get the pre-assessment done? And then can we get the testing period in before the next cycle in regards to, hey, say, you know, a lot of people come in January and say, hey, we need a SOC 2 type 2 next week. You know, obviously we sit down, we explain, hey, we can do a pre-assessment, you know, depending on if you have a full-time person that's willing to do that, or, you know, or it may take 6 months to get that done. And then maybe we do a 6 month at the end of the year. So it's I'm not sure there's a great answer, but I think it really is dictated by the user entity.
Without question, Dave. I think that was a great answer, and I think the user entity does dictate it. The one thing I do caution, as we talk about dictating the user entities, if you have 25 user entities, they all may want a different reporting period or length of reporting period, so to speak. And you know, for some, a 6 month is perfectly acceptable. For others, they don't want anything less than a 9 month because they can't accept more than a 3 month gap between your next report, obviously being done annually. So, you know, there is an aspect of you can't please everybody. You've got to attempt to please the masses, and there will be some that will not be happy with it. But I certainly think that, you know, it depends on, you know, who's using it, you know, the particularness of what they're using it for, how demanding the user entities, auditors may be, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, if you're a new client, you could do a 6 month period just to get it done at 12/31, then switch to a year after that. So absolutely, it's definitely flexible. I also see that people do a 6 month and they'll really keep the environment really the same through that 6 months, and then they'll use that next 6 months to sort of, you know, do their changes and then test new controls on the next 6 months. So the thing you got to worry about is if you do a year, is any controls that change in there, you're going to have to test the environment before and after. Correct. So it gets, you know, it gets complicated, and I think, you know, you got to think about those things ahead of time, just from a testing standpoint, environment standpoint. You don't want to switch your data center midstream unless you're thinking, hey, I'm going to test both sides. So it's complicated.
Good. The only thing I would add before we move on to the next question is to give some consideration as well to the nature and the frequency of the kinds of controls that the organization relies on. And while you can, and we generally don't see it and we don't like it, you can argue for a shorter than the 6 month period if there are facts and circumstances that dictate it. If the organization relies very heavily on controls that may only occur once a quarter, to minimize the length of that period makes it very difficult to actually test the controls in place. So as you're evaluating that, even 6 months, if 6 months doesn't allow you to get a comprehensive enough population of the types of controls that are most important, it really would dictate some of the thought process on how you go forward on a period. So the next question is really tied right into that length of period, and that is, how do you determine the period end date for the SOC 2 Type 2? So I've chosen my 6 month, 9 month, 12 month, whatever I feel is most important. Josh, Dave, how do you pick that point in time which will define the end of that period?
So there's, once again, not necessarily an easy question or easy answer for this question, but it really, you know, you focus and look at who is asking for it, what users or customers are asking for it. Try to identify timeframes that they're asking for it. A lot of times you'll get, questionnaires and things around, calendar year end, et cetera. One thing that I do comment about, and I do this in the SOC 2, examination world as well as the SOC 1 world is the question is if everybody is expecting or asking for this thing and they're, this report in, December and January, you may want to consider a November 30th or October 31st period end. If it's a 6-month period, 6-month period ending October 31st or a 6-month period ending November 30th, or a 9 or 12-month period ending those same dates, there's no requirement for it to be calendar year to calendar year. One of the things that I say about that is that kind of ensures a delivery of the report in that December, November, December timeframe to your customers, so that, their auditors, their vendor management, whoever's looking at it and demanding it, whoever wants it by year end, has it by year end in hand, though it doesn't carry, the period may not carry all the way through year end. That's certainly not an issue. So, the other thing, and not to steal the kind of thunder away from Dave, as he mentioned at the last question, was, depends on when you're starting your period based upon if it's the first year you're having this done. Hey, I want to do a 6-month period. We just got our pre-assessment wrapped up in November. Let's start January 1 through June 30th, and that's certainly fine. The question will be is, are you, when you provide that report at, in July 15th or July 20th to your customers, are they going to ask for another one in December? And if that's the case, then, you got them something at hand and you do a second 6 months, or, you can't carry forward to a year going forward. But, the period end date really speaks to the majority of your customers when they typically ask for it, when they typically need it. In some cases, it's part of the contractual agreement that you have with the customer that you'll provide it. It does not detail any dates, as far as, when it has to be reported. Maybe it's just an annual SOC 2 report or a SOC 2 report every year, whether that's June 30th or September 30th or whatever. So, I think you want to really look at your requests from customers, look at the deadlines, for report delivery that they may have outlined to you, and try to appeal, as the bullet point says, to the majority of customers. There's no formula or ability to do one of these reports every month that somebody's asking for one. So, you're trying to keep the majority happy and know that you're going to deal with a few people that may not be, a few customers that may want it at a different time. So,
Dave, I think you covered it pretty well. You got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think in reality, you've got to think about, and people might be new to SOC on this call, a pre-assessment really is necessary in order to do these SOC 2, whether it's a type 1 or a type 2. And, there's quite a few criteria that controls have to be mapped to. And a lot of organizations will have controls in place already that can be mapped to those criteria. But more times than not, there's a ton of controls that have to be created and put in place for that to happen. And that, pre-assessment could take a while. So in reality, when that pre-assessment ends, whether that's, July 1st or July 15th or whatever, that's when the period starts. So, and it depends on, what the pressure is from the user entity. So, if it's a 12/31, the user entity wants it and, they're not done to sometime in July with the pre-assessment, a lot of times it'll, the period end will shift to January 31st. So in reality, it's really the pressure from the user entity and when you can get the pre-assessment done. Now, that's not saying, like Josh just said, you can change the period or the end date the following year, but that initial period end date, I think, is always sort of, when can we get it done soon?
That's a good point. Good point. All right. Well, in the interest of time, let's keep going, as we have a few more questions to answer. First is our second polling question. Again, you need to answer this for CPE. So if you'll take a look on screen, which statement do you consider most accurate for your company regarding SOC 2 examinations? Do you have one? You're thinking about one, you don't get one, but you do get asked for it, and you're just not going to bother. So while our listeners are answering that question, Josh, Dave, I'm going to go to one of the questions that came in from our audience. And maybe this is a good way for you guys to fill some time while folks answer the question here. So some tips or ideas. The request was, are there some tips or ideas on dealing with a qualified opinion on a SOC 2 from one of your major vendors? So you guys have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I definitely do. I have seen from a couple vendors qualified opinions, and it really comes down to now you have to dive into that SOC report and figure out what control failed. You know, obviously there's controls in there that failed, and since it's a qualified report, there's probably you know, whole areas that possibly failed. So I think, you know, you have to, as a unit entity, look at what those exceptions are and how that affects your organization, and what mitigating controls can you put in place to maybe mitigate the fact that their controls are not working. I also like to look on that qualified report and see if there's any kind of management response. You know, what are they doing, et cetera. So those are big things, you know, and the qualified report, is it, you know, in more than a couple different areas, you know, what's the extent of it? You know, I think with COVID now, you're going to see a few more qualified reports just because of the environment changed so much last year in regards to on-site to remote. And a lot of times, you know, we like to think security's in the forefront, and we think we're putting controls, but, you know, last March, you know, people were just trying to get people to work. I don't think that you write off a vendor that has a qualified report, but I think you have to sit down and read that thing and then assess from your risk assessment point of view how that affects your organization.
Dave, you did a great job hitting that nail on the head with that one. But, you know, I really think that's, you know, it comes down to risk. What was the qualification for? What was it related to? I mean, a report can be qualified if, you know, there's no instances of controls actually operating or instances of them occurring for a whole set of controls where you basically qualify the report to say we couldn't test the operating effectiveness because they had no instances that this occurred. In which case it's, you know, that's less of a qualified opinion based upon, you know, the fact that they failed controls and more that there wasn't instances of it occurring. But there's also times that it could be a design effectiveness issue, you know, a small organization with 5 employees and a sole, you know, one owner. You know, one of the criteria for security is having an independent board, and certainly that's hard to meet that. So the question is did they get a qualified opinion because they didn't have an independent board? And then you question, well, what's the real risk here? If we were willing to continue business with them before, but without that, why force them into that structure, so to speak? But that really speaks to it. It's addressing the risk. What is the reason for the qualification, and what risks does that impact have on, you know, on our organization using them as a service organization?
Good, thanks, guys. I hope at this point everybody got the question answered. So let's see what our polling results are. Looks like we have a good blend of we currently get, we do not get, but are thinking about it. And a few who say we're just not going to do it. And for those who are on that fourth bucket, be aware that at some point, it was mentioned earlier, at some point, vendors are going to make it a condition of contract. We're starting to see that more frequently. Our customers are going to make it a condition of contract. So that's a good cross-section of folks. Thanks for answering that question, both for our information and for your CPE validity. So we're going to move on to a couple more final questions here as we come into the home stretch of our prepared conversation. And this next question is a pretty significant matter when really trying to structure a SOC report for the first time. And that is really analyzing what the impact of the vendors that you rely on are on your SOC report. So I think there's a lot here in this question, and I would ask my panelists to kind of hit the highlights, because we could spend 15 minutes on this one, but we want to get into some other things here before we wrap up. So the question is how we determine whether the service organization uses subservice organizations, and that idea between a vendor and a subservice. And then we'll get into, with our next question, what we do about that. The first question is, how do I analyze the impact of my vendors on my environment that my customers are relying on.
So, kind of determining whether you use a subservice organization or you're using a vendor, the real thing that I always ask, and I'll try to keep this brief, but is, if it's a subservice organization, if they're performing, in my opinion, a service that includes controls and reliance from your organization on the work that they're doing. So if you, kind of provide, use another another organization to, process or specifically handle customer backups, and you're a data center, and you've subbed out the backup, you've provided a service to your clients to have backups, and you've used another organization to do that. Obviously, that's a subservice because you're taking a service that you would typically perform for your customers, and your customers rely on you for, and that data of theirs is going to this other organization. It's just a subservice of yours. Whereas a vendor relationship may just be as something as simple as, you use some outsourced staffing that you credential through your network, and that's more of a vendor where you're still maintaining the controls within your organization. So it really speaks to trust and where the controls lie in the subservice versus vendor aspect. Dave, you want to expound on that a little bit more?
Yeah, real quickly. I think then you have to decide, hey, if it's going to be a subservice organization, is it going to be carved out or is it going to be inclusive, right? So a carved out is a lot easier way to go. Do you have monitoring controls in place for the subservice organization? Inclusive, you're getting a little deeper and you're actually testing the controls of that subservice organization, like you're testing the controls of the subservice organization that you're doing the SOC work for. So it's a lot more in depth. I mean, you're going to need it's a lot more in depth. We could do a whole nother session on inclusive.
Well, we had a whole nother question on it, but you already answered. I skipped ahead.
One of the things that I always like to think about is if you're answering a question on a control, on a trust service criteria control with, we don't do that, we hire this organization to do that, you probably have a subservice organization in that case. So, we don't touch that, we let them do it. Well, you've basically, now that subservice organization is part of your controls of what you have committed to clients on the work that you're doing.
And to kind of extend into what Dave was just talking about with carve out versus inclusive, as you do that analysis that Josh just mentioned, and you completely rely on another organization to do something that is important to your environment or to your users, that whole carve out versus inclusive, well, it is easier to do carve out if not including the details around that vendor, that subservice organization, take such a significant part away from what your control environment looks like, you can't carve it out. If it is such a substantive and significant component of how you do what you do, then you have to do inclusive method. And inclusive method is more intrusive, it's more work. You have to have management of the subservice organization involved in the process, and they have to commit to certain things and agree to be tested. So it's not just about what do they do and is it important to reference, but is it so important that if I carve it out, my SOC report now becomes almost meaningless to my customers?
Yeah, I think we could have a whole webinar on carve out versus inclusive. Not sure we'd have any attendees, but it would be a whole webinar.
Is that next quarter, Dave?
Possibly.
No, I think, and it's important too to understand, as Josh talked about a little bit, there's a fine line between a vendor and a subservice organization, and vendors are really those organizations that provision something to you that's important, but it's something you could move around to another vendor and it wouldn't really change things, or it's, I don't even have a good example off the top of my head, but a subservice organization really provides part of your control environment versus a vendor just maybe providing a component of your infrastructure or a resource to you. But it really is an important analysis, as Dave said. It's a conversation. We could go through 10 examples over the course of a webinar, and they would be nuanced enough that they would sound the same but come to a different conclusion. And I'm not suggesting we do that, Dave or Josh, because I think you're right. We might have 4 participants in that one, and 3 of them would be us. So Josh, Dave, anything else to add on either subservice or the inclusive versus carve out?
I think you just got to realize that, you know, with the inclusive, you're gonna be testing the controls of that vendor. You're going to be on site, possibly. You know, it's going to be intrusive, and you have to have agreement with that vendor to do it. You know, they're going to be signing a management rep letter, an assertion. So it's going to be more work for sure for us and for the client as well as the vendor.
Yeah. So it is 10-3. So we're in the home stretch here. We have one more prepared question that we hear all the time and see all the time. And then we do have another question, at least one that has come in from one of our attendees. So the question that's on your screen now is one that we hear on that first phone call. And it comes as a result of there is finally a customer of theirs that says, I have to pull this contract if you don't have a SOC 2, or I'm now giving you this final contract to sign for a significant piece of work and I want to use you, but a condition in the contract is that you have a SOC 2 type 2, and if you don't have one, we can't really go forward with this lucrative opportunity. So how quick can I get my SOC 2 report so I can sign this contract and get it to them? So Josh, Dave, what are the things we need to think through on that, and what is the boilerplate answer that we always have to give?
So, you know, it typically takes it's not a quick process. One of the things that I always caution anybody, you know, who gets asked for a SOC report, you know, you cannot commit to, oh yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. You know, we'll go ahead and get you one of those. It's got to be an understanding that, you know, there's a pre-assessment process where, you know, there's approximately, I believe, 36, it changes every now and again, common criteria for security, plus you may be looking at other criteria for availability, you know, processing integrity, et cetera. You know, those are the number of control objectives you have to meet, and there's typically, you know, 3 to 5 to 8 controls under each objective. And you know, that doesn't necessarily mean you have all those controls in place. You may not have all the documentation. So the pre-assessment process takes that role, where we go through and really, you know, develop your controls and make sure you have documentation so you can get a good report. And that process takes time. I mean, it's everything from we want to have it done in 6 weeks. I mean, it's usually a 3 to 12 month process till it's up and going. And then that's before you can even get a type 1 report. You know, type 1 report at the end of the process gives you something, you know, the pre-assessment gives you something to hand your customers. That being said, a type 2, after the pre-assessment ends, there's a testing period, 6 months, 12 months, 9 months, whatever it is. So, you know, you could be looking at, you know, very easily, you know, depending on what, you know, where you're at, you can be looking at a year to 2 years till you can get your first report. Now, I mean, obviously, if you've done some of the processes in, you know, beforehand and you've started to develop controls, then you're in a different position. So, you know, it can be a little quicker with the pre-assessment and so forth. But in most cases, we're starting from scratch. It takes a significant time to get your hands on that first type 2 report.
Yeah, I think it comes down to 2 things for an organization to complete a pre-assessment. One thing is resources, you know, and then the second thing is what security do you have in place already? You know, are you using this framework? Are you using another framework? Is there controls in there that we can map to the, you know, the COSO framework that, you know, that we use for SOC? And then the resources is a huge thing. If you have a full-time security guy, and you know, like we said, some of the environmental controls are not security related, they're more HR related. But if you have an individual in charge of that, that's their main focus, et cetera. Yeah, we could fast line this. But most organizations don't have those time and resources. So emergencies come up, et cetera, and it takes 3 to 12 months, like Josh said. But don't let that scare you. If you want to put the resources in place and get this done, it's possible. Not likely, but possible.
Good. That is the stock answer that we always give. So last polling question as we're finishing up here. So I would ask you to answer this question from the conversation earlier. We can clearly define the scope of a SOC 2 report and the related applicable trust services criteria. And while we take a minute for folks to answer that question, to log their response and get their CPE, I'm going to go ahead and ask the other question that came in from our audience. So Josh and Dave, the question is, are SOC 2 reports the best for vendor management? So any thoughts on that?
So
I guess I can if you don't want to.
I absolutely. I was just about to. So I don't think the correct answer would be the best for it. I think it's really a component of what, it's one component of good vendor management. Certainly, I think that you as an organization have to understand, what your vendors do for you, which ones may be a service organization. Certainly, if they're a service organization that you're, entrusting with data or, information that you want security over, then a SOC 2 report is absolutely without question a key component of that. And you should be, kind of mapping the vendors that you expect to get those SOC 2 reports from. There's other instances where I think demanding or requesting a SOC 2 report from a specific vendor that doesn't do something that's really relevant to what you would expect to get out of a SOC 2 report, something security, availability, et cetera, is putting a burden on that vendor for something that may not actually pertain to a whole lot of value to back to you. So I think it's a component, a good component of vendor management to say that it's the really to speak to the fact that it's the only the best thing for vendor management, I think is probably not necessarily accurate, because every vendor, every situation, every organization is different, and making sure you're looking at vendor management from the risks is really the most important thing.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the vendor and how much risk that vendor poses for your organization. That a SOC 2 might be fine for that. A SOC 2 plus a bunch of other questions may be fine for that. Obviously, if they have a SOC 2, that puts them in a different league in my eyes. I've seen some bad SOC 2s, but most of them, tell you some good information. Now, if it's a, janitorial services of your organization, depending on your organization, that might not, you don't need a SOC 2 report for them. So it really depends on the vendor, but I think it's a great place to start. And if it's a substantial vendor for you, I think you need one, and you may have to ask more questions than that. Again, because that SOC 2 report is based for the majority of user entities, and every user entity is unique and needs very different things. So hopefully the majority of that SOC 2 covers what you're asking for, but 9 out of 10 times there's going to be 10% that's not in that SOC 2 report that you're still wanting.
No, I agree. I do think it's an important part of what you need to do with vendors, particularly critical ones. Whether it's best or not, I think that all depends, right? So the other thing I would mention on that, and maybe we put the results of the polling question up on screen, and I will close with just on that SOC, the vendor management side. There is a service called SOC for Supply Chains, which is something you may want to consider asking for. It's not widely used at this stage. We see it very rarely. But SOC for Supply Chains is an internal control report on the way a company, the system controls for producing, manufacturing, and distributing goods to understand the cybersecurity risks within their supply chain. So that may be something worth looking at if you're truly concerned about vendor risk management. That idea of an internal SOC for supply chains could be of use. So looks like some of our audience is ready, some are not, and some don't care and never will be, and that's perfectly okay. So appreciate the response on that. So that was our 3 polling questions for CPE credit. We did have one question come in just here recently that I will try and capture quickly here, and I'll ask gentlemen, for the Reader's Digest 30,000-foot version of the answer to this so we can wrap it up. So as auditors, we've encountered user entities who obtain SOC reports for their vendors with carved out subservice organizations, but they haven't addressed the risks that the controls at the subservice organizations present. When we inquire whether they've asked for the subservice organization SOC report, they have no recourse to request or obtain them. So what other options do we have to get assurance over the subservice organizations? That's a handful. I don't know if there's time to answer that comprehensively, but do you guys have any initial thoughts on that?
I think you're still, I think from a carved out standpoint, you're still looking at those controls in the description. You should still see those controls, and you should see how the monitoring of those controls are being done. And if that's, it almost sounds like it should be inclusive. Is that what they're leaning towards here, Mike?
I think what they're trying to understand is when they have carved out subservice organizations present in a report, they are not able to see what controls that subservice organization has in place, and certainly that's one of those situations where that comes back to the original service organization that you've gotten the SOC report from. They should be able to, they should be monitoring those controls, Dave, as you said. If I'm a service organization and I carve out subservice organization X, it's expected and anticipated that, I either obtain a SOC report from that subservice organization I've carved out, or I actually have monitoring to say, here's the controls that they provided me that they do. I ask them for additional detail on these, or maybe it's, if you're using a data center, it's a small aspect of what your actual services are. Maybe you show up and visit 3 times a year to look at your servers and you verify the controls they have in place. That's the monitoring that they should be doing. And I think in most cases, the original service organization should be able to provide you detail on what controls they know are in place at that service organization. And if they aren't, they really haven't done their monitoring or their due diligence potentially from that perspective.
And if that's all fallen apart, it's not, you can still ask that subservice organization to go and ask them questions directly, fill out an Excel spreadsheet of what the controls are, et cetera. I mean, there's nothing to say that, hey, the SOC report just doesn't do it for you. We're going to go back to prehistoric before SOC report, and here's the Excel questions, and what are your controls surrounding these areas? There's nothing to say you can't do that. Yeah. And that's where I would go. I would be pressing that vendor, that subservice organization, for their controls. If shame on the vendor for not being able to provide that.
Yeah, I think I'll close with just on top of that. I think the complementary subservice organization controls should be laid out in that service organization SOC report. And if they are not, then you should be challenging the service organization as to whether their report is truly comprehensive enough on the environment. If you can't tell what's going on at the subservice organizations, then there may need to be more detail in that SOC report. So, but your fallback is, if it's that critical to what you're relying on as an auditor, your fallback is to go to the subservice organization directly, as Dave said. So I want to wrap it up. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go back to the service auditor and ask questions about that report.
You can always go back to the service auditor.
I mean, that would be another option. Get more clarification.
Yep.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to close it out. We're just a little after 3 here, so we appreciate everybody's attention. Thank you for joining us. And if you have further questions on things that we were unable to answer, or you didn't like the answer that the 3 of us gave to that last question, you may feel free absolutely to reach out to any one of us. Our contact information is on screen, and we will be more than happy to talk through these or other questions you have. As you might have figured out from our conversation today, it's a practice area that the 3 of us very much enjoy. We like helping companies navigate through it to a successful outcome, to not just meet their customers' needs, but also to find ways to add value. When we work through a SOC engagement with a new client of ours, our goal is to help find and add value in that control environment, not just to get a document that is sufficient to give to your customers. So please reach out, ask questions, and we'd love to talk. So I'll close with this. A recording of our presentation today will be posted to our website and social media sites in a few days. For those who requested CPE and answered all 3 polling questions, look for your certificates within the next 2 weeks. And thank you again for joining us. We appreciate having you on this webinar. We appreciate any questions that you have that we can help with, and enjoy the rest of your day.